Welcome to another episode of Professor and the Idiot. I'm Nick Wolfinger.
I'm Amy Newberg. I'm the Idiot.
And as always, we will have a discussion of how we came to that name. But first, let's introduce our guest so he can jump in. We're very pleased this week to have George Hawley, who is a professor at the University of Alabama and the author of many books, including Understand the Alt-Right. And he's done a lot of scholarship that is very relevant to the current political moment. So with that, let's jump into it. But before we jump into it, you should say, "Hey, I'm George," or something.
Hey, I'm George.
Awesome.
Good to be here.
Welcome, George.
Yeah,
Thank you.
we're glad to have you. So first question I had is, are you at all related to Josh Hawley?
Not immediately. I did a long time ago have some distant relatives who came out of Missouri before moving to Washington State, but not in the last century. So if we're related, it's in a fairly distant way.
Okay. And if anyone doesn't know, Josh Hawley is a Republican junior senator of Missouri and a rising star of the party. How did you end up being a political scientist?
Well, I had been working in sort of practical politics for a couple of years after I graduated from my undergrad degree with my degree in journalism, and found that I really wasn't very well suited for that. I am not a particularly partisan or ideological person, and I found it hard to sustain the type of I guess you could say, ideological energy necessary to want to do the whole Beltway thing for a consistent amount of time. So I applied to graduate programs thinking I would be better suited to studying politics than actually doing it. And so that's what I've been doing since then.
Is there a particular reason you went to Alabama, or is it just the exigencies, I can never say that word, of the academic job market?
Well, I had a couple of possible options, but I was still waiting to get it formally decided that another place was going to actually make the offer. And I had an offer in hand from Alabama that wasn't going to last forever. And my wife was from Alabama, so it's a good school, and it's been a good job. So I'm glad I took that opportunity.
How did you start studying right-wing extremism, or is that even the right question?
No,
would you say you studied? Yeah.
Yeah, it's not. It wasn't. Initially, when I went to graduate school, my thought was that I was going to be a political theorist. But within my first semester as a graduate student, I was looking at what the job market looked like for the different fields, and thought, well, what I really need is to be able to get hired. So I spent my graduate studying quantitative methods in American political behavior. Yeah. And that was the subject of my dissertation in my first couple of books and several of my first articles. But eventually I decided to sort of go back to my earlier interests. Once it became clear to me, once I have the job, all the higher ups cares that I publish, not necessarily what my specific field is. At least that's been my experience at Alabama. So I took a risk and went back and approached a subject that I had been thinking about for quite some time, and that is sort of the evolution of the conservative movement and how it has dealt with challengers on the right. And that became a book that I wrote back in 2014 called Right-Wing Critics of American Conservatism, which, because of the slowness of academic publishing, didn't actually come out until 2016. But the timing was actually pretty fortuitous because it came out just around the time that Trump was announcing his candidacy for president. And that book covered lots of ground, lots of intellectual history for libertarians, for paleoconservatives, for secularists on the right, for European right-wing movements. But I did have one chapter on white nationalism in America, which sort of set me up well to start writing on the alt-right, which I would argue is just one more manifestation of that movement that has always existed in some form or another in the United States, especially since the post-war years.
So I have a couple of basic questions.
Sure.
I'm curious about the definition, in your eyes, of the alt-right. where is the demarcation between the right and the alt-right? I guess I have in my mind that the alt-right is known for sort of trolling, specifically in non-fact-based philosophies, like they're sort of actively trying to convince people as opposed to just sitting around thinking stuff. And then you just used a term called, I think it was paleo-conservative. Is that what you said?
Yes.
What is that?
I guess I'll start with the second question.
Okay.
Paleoconservatism is a movement that began in the 1980s. It was a reaction to the rise of neoconservatism of the 1970s. The neoconservatives were, for the most part, former leftists, or at least liberals, who began moving into the conservative direction. We're starting around in the late 1960s. And for the most part, the other conservatives were delighted to have them. They brought a lot of intellectual heft. They had a lot of credibility within sort of mainstream intellectual circles. But they started to cause a lot of pushback from other parts of the mainstream right, who thought that they were getting just a little bit too pushy and demanding and insisting that, you know, the rest of the conservative movement toe the line with their new agenda. And so those sort of more reactionary older conservatives who didn't like the neoconservative influence took on the title of paleoconservatives as a way of demarcating themselves from their new opponents. And the 1980s especially was a time of great vitriol between these two groups. But I would say that in the long run, the neoconservatives were unquestionably the winning force there and became the dominant force within the Republican Party and the conservative intellectual movement.
Can I ask? Go on. Sorry, George.
I was going to ask if that answered the question, or if I should move on to the other question.
Yeah, let's go on to the definition of the alt-right.
All right. This is a subject on which there is some disagreement. Some people use a wider definition and some will use a more narrow one. And quite frankly, you know, what definition is most appropriate will kind of depend on what period in recent history you're talking about. But as for me, I define the alt-right fairly narrowly. And will say that the alt-right is fundamentally a white nationalist movement. So it is a radical right-wing movement focused fundamentally on race. Now, others have offered different definitions. I mean, for a while, and I think that during certain periods of time that these definitions might have had some accuracy to them. Like during the late 2015, early 2016, for a while, the term alt-right was viewed almost as synonymous with then candidate's Trump entire right-wing populist movement. That was the period in which, for example, Steve Bannon called Breitbart a platform of the alt-right. So it was a specific context in which he said that. And similarly, if we go back to 2009, when the term alternative right was first born, it was a bit more ecumenical, kind of applying to anyone who was right-wing, but was opposed to sort of George W. Bush-style conservatism. But the one common thread, I would say, that has been consistent throughout the alt-right's history is that the primary ideologues pushing the movement and the people who stuck with it through its ups and downs have tended to be of the racist right. And that has been sort of a key element and theme throughout the movement's history.
And they have been around a long time and are still around, and yet you've written a paper about the alt-right having had a couple of peaks and valleys, and recently we haven't really heard much about them. So it sounds like it's sort of a name change over time.
I would agree with that. The term alt-right, one of its benefits it had a couple of benefits while it was on the rise. First of all, it's innocuous enough sounding. It's a name that signifies, okay, this is a right-wing movement, and it's a movement that is different from the mainstream. And the alternative, or the alt in the name, kind of suggests it might be a little bit countercultural or something, maybe a little bit more youth oriented, but it doesn't necessarily signify the type of radicalism as a title such as, say, white nationalist does, or white supremacist does, or white separatist. It's a non-threatening title to sort of introduce people to the ideology and the movement. And frankly, another benefit I think that it had, one of the things that helped it sort of take off without any central direction, was simply the fact that it fit neatly within a hashtag.
Yes.
And so, hashtag alt-right, I think, was one of the reasons it started taking off in 2014, 2015. Back when Twitter had half as many characters as it does now, I think that was a key element to its initial success. But the benefits of the label, I think, are now mostly gone. I don't think that most people view the alt-right as innocuous in the way that they might have in 2015. So I think people have moved on from the title. I don't know of very many people who would call themselves alt-right anymore. So I've increasingly begun talking about the alt-right in the past tense as opposed to as a contemporary movement.
Did Charlottesville kill it?
I think so. I think that was the ultimate thing that brought it down. I mean, that caused so many problems for the movement. First of all, obviously, it made global headlines, but it was universally negative. And the people that were associated with it, as much as the alt-right had tried to build sort of a new brand for the far right, the imagery that came out of Charlottesville, it looked a lot like the kind of neo-Nazi rallies that you would have seen back in the old days of the National Alliance, or more recently from groups like the National Socialist Movement. The pretty unappealing neo-Nazi crowd was certainly in attendance there, and so that would always be associated with the alt-right from that point on. And then of course you have the issue of the violence that occurred there. And the lawsuits that followed have definitely been devastating to what few fledgling organizations were being created around that time.
I didn't know about the lawsuits. Who was being sued? The Richard Spencer?
Yeah, essentially anyone who was involved in formally organizing it. So Richard Spencer was facing it, the people associated with the now defunct Traditionalist Worker Party being sued, Jason Kessler, who was the primary organizer, being sued. There's all sorts of various lawsuits that are consuming massive amounts of time and resources. I should note this was the same issue that brought down so many of these similar organizations back in the 1990s. It was largely lawsuits that crippled groups like the Church of the Creator, like the Aryan Nations, like
right. Yeah, I remember that.
What were they being sued for?
Generally, what would happen is somebody who was associated with the movement would go off and engage in some kind of extraordinary violence, and then the organizations to which they belonged would be held accountable, and that tended to be the norm.
Yeah.
So I assume if you were in the alt-right, you would happily identify as such, like it wasn't sort of an insulting name that we've given them. They gave that name to themselves. Yeah,
it was one that they came up with on their own.
Yeah.
But it seemed like only a tiny percentage of them identified publicly using their own names as alt-right. A lot of them lived pseudonymously.
Yeah, I would say that the alt-right on social media was predominantly anonymous, and I think this was one of the things that made the effort to transition from a online movement to a real-world movement such a challenge. After the election, I think there was a lot of hope on the far right. Well, now you don't want to just be posting insults on social media. You want to be a real-world force, and all of the efforts, even prior to Charlottesville, to sort of force that to happen, ended up being not very successful. And it really turned out there wasn't an effective way of transitioning from the internet to the real world without, losing some of the things that made the alt-right, gave it some advantages beforehand. And
like memes.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how you do a rally of memes, right? But that could work. And so they ended up sort of looking a little bit more like its predecessors than I think people would have wanted.
In the line of questions about what happened to the alt-right, brings to mind someone, a former Twitter friend, someone who would freely discuss his ideas with me. That was Frame Game Radio. Do you remember him?
Sort of rings a bell, but I quit Twitter a long time ago.
Okay. Frame Game Radio was an alt-right organizer, and he had about 35,000 followers. And I mentioned him because he would politely and cordially argue with me in public, which I did. And one very curious thing about him is he was Jewish, but yet freely made the usual case about the Jewish cabal running everything. Anyhow, I was wondering, he had a big presence there, and he produced slick professional videos, but he just vanished. I was wondering if you knew if he had gotten deplatformed or if he had just decided to get on with his life. He was a New York attorney in real life.
I'm not sufficiently familiar with that specific case to tell you, but I do know. Well, was he doxxed, I guess is the question. Do we know, was his identity
Not to my knowledge.
If he had been, it probably would have been news. But what I will say is that a good percentage of the people that I was interviewing for the initial book, a lot of them are just, they were never doxxed. They were never, got in any trouble. They just sort of stopped.
Right.
A lot of them I have no way of contacting with them because I had only ever interacted via their anonymous avatars,
right,
in direct messaging, and a lot of them just deleted their accounts and have, I assume, just gone on with their life. And part of it, I think, probably was a fear. If you keep doing this long enough with the amount of scrutiny that's on people, one is increasingly likely to get caught eventually. I think that was part of it. And I think another part of it is that as the movement faced increasing setbacks and in a lot of ways became highly dysfunctional, engaging in lots of, very vitriolic infighting, becoming almost a bit of a circular firing squad. I think whatever fun people were having with it,
right.
I think that started to go away. And so I think that more than anything has been pushing people out of engaging in these kinds of online activities.
I mean, that certainly strikes me as endemic of any extremist movement, that there will be a lot of infighting, and groups will always break into a bunch of different factions. I could start to see that happening as I read about the alt-right.
So did you try to measure the alt-right and see how many people were identified?
No, and there's not really an easy thing to do. But I will say, Thomas Maine, who wrote a book called The Rise of the Alt-Right, he's done probably about as good of a job as you can to try and figure out what is the absolute maximum of this movement. And I think his intuition is correct. I suspect that, the absolute minimum that I think one would have to do to be considered part of the alt-right is to visit the main alt-right websites. As a predominantly online phenomenon, I don't know how one would come to identify with it otherwise. So he was looking at web traffic at the biggest alt-right websites, and overall, I think he couldn't conclude that maybe more than 1 million people were regularly consuming this sort of stuff online. So that would be.
Could you tell how many of them were Americans? Because I could certainly see European right populists visiting those sites.
I don't, as far as I know, I don't think that was part of his web traffic design. The one thing I would think that might maybe mitigate that is that now there's in some ways perhaps a livelier right-wing populist scene in Europe than there is here. So they might not be leaning so much on American sites at this point.
Okay, 1 million people to me sounds really frightening, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's not really that many people.
Well, you need to realize when I'm seeing 1 million people looking at the websites. If we're thinking about the people actually creating content, who are actually creating these online avatars and trying to engage in just even stuff anonymously online, then you were probably down to several thousand people. And if we think about Unite the Right, for all of the drama behind it and that occurred that day, this was definitely the largest gathering, largest white nationalist gathering in the United States since 2002 when William Pierce died. But when we say it's the largest, we're still talking about maybe 1,000 people for something that had been hyped up for months.
Yeah.
So, and then a nation of more than 300 million people, numbers wise, that's not that shocking. I mean, obviously, most people would rather it be zero, but we shouldn't overstate the number of people in the population we're talking about here.
So a small number of people getting an awful lot of attention. Why do you think they got so much attention? There were some pretty flamboyant characters that certainly made the news.
Yeah, and another element to it was one of the insights that the alt-right had, and I think other elements on the extreme right knew this as well, was the degree to which you can kind of create in a sense, a bit of a false reality for a segment of American journalists. We need to think about the amount of time that important media figures spend on places like Twitter. And, back before there was, more aggressive enforcement of Twitter rules, you could find that plenty of people who were important figures in the media would, every time they turn on their computer, they'd see that their mentions were absolutely full of just absolutely vile, racist, anti-Semitic material, and in a sense created this vision of America as having this really large, really menacing, really significant new extreme right movement. When most people, when they turn on their computers, weren't seeing this. So I called it a sense of sort of a digital Potemkin village that the alt-right managed to create in front of the eyes of people who they needed to get in front of.
Do you think the media had some responsibility in bringing attention to their message and sort of making people more curious about it and going to those sites?
It's difficult to say, right? Because, on the one hand, you can say, well, if they hadn't done that, nobody would have heard about it. But, the fact that the alt-right has been so effectively really kind of wiped off the map over the past couple of years, what would have happened if they hadn't done it? I don't know, right? I will say that after Hillary Clinton's speech in 2016, she gave a speech in Reno in August of that year, entirely on the subject of the alt-right. And after that happened, there was definitely an explosion in web searches trying to figure out who this was. And so, perhaps that did lead to a surge of people taking an interest in something they might not have known about before. On the other hand, I'm not convinced that speech didn't actually cause a little bit of drop in support for Donald Trump. So in some sense, it might have been not an ineffective speech, even if it wasn't sufficient to bring the election to her way in the end.
I guess we'll never know, but I always thought that actually calling a share of Trump voters, and I quote, a basket of deplorables was a gaffe, a bad move.
Oh, absolutely. That was a separate speech, mind you. But yes, I agree.
It was. I'm sorry, I conflated the speech with my mind.
Well, how do you feel about? I mean, this is sort of a little off topic, I guess, but I'm just always curious about the media's balancing act between reporting, sensationalist philosophies and trying to ignore them so that there's not too much attention brought to them. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I don't have a really strong opinion on this because, there's going to be different media venues doing different things. And, in this age where anybody can, declare themselves journalists, people, various views are ways of doing this are going to be popular or not. I do think that perhaps movements like this get an outside amount of attention, probably for a couple of reasons. One, I think there's sort of a prurient interest in it. If we think about the right, like people are a lot more interested in sort of the swastika armbands than, more important but more boring budgeting issues determining, who's going to be getting their unemployment benefits cut off. And to a certain extent, I think a lot of activists on the left would rather fight the alt-right than, some of the more faceless challenges to a more equitable society.
Low-hanging fruit, yeah.
Yeah, and again, it's dramatic and it leads to street battles and makes for good pictures. So I'm not going to belittle the people who pursued that type of journalism, that type of activism. But I do think that it's important to keep some perspective as to what has a greater influence over American life.
Let me try out a theory on you. So I was interested in the results of one study which showed that the same people who supported George Wallace in 1968 also were supporting Trump 40 years later. And over the same years, the Republican Party became increasingly white. It's now, I checked data a little while ago in 2018, it was 74% white. So what about the argument that basically the Republican Party it is a white nationalist party in itself, and it has effectively co-opted those elements?
Well, I guess it's a matter of, I guess if you say that it's the party that predominantly appeals to white people, that's unquestionably true. But to say that the Republican Party is the party of white nationalism, I think would downplay what white nationalists actually want. That is, so they're not just calling for a reduction of immigration rates or, strengthening of border security. What's the key ideologues of white nationalism and of the alt-right at its peak were calling for was things like mass deportations of people who are already American citizens. So we can say that there are plenty of reasons to criticize the Republican Party, but I think to equate sort of your typical Republican politician with the alt-right, I think would require severely downplaying
No.
the radicalism.
Yeah, I would. No. I wouldn't do that. I was just saying, I wouldn't go that far, of course.
But you are right about you can see echoes of George Wallace in Trump. Wallace was sort of the 20th century, at least the post-war 20th century's, quintessential right-wing populist, somebody who was all about the racially charged rhetoric, but also not at all interested in conservative arguments about government spending. Perfectly happy to have a strong, vigorous welfare state, vigorously anti-communist, but not really interested in, Friedrich Hayek's, theories about the economy. And you can see the same thing with Trump, right? I think Trump was unquestionably a right-wing populist. I don't think that anyone could possibly feel insulted by me making that claim.
Well, he hasn't governed as one, but he campaigned.
That's the thing. That's been the most. This was. I got a lot of people have been really surprised by the way that the Trump administration has worked out, that he really has been in a lot of ways a very conventional Republican. Yeah. And the best way I can explain that is that, Trumpism kind of put the cart before the horse, getting elected president without having any kind of institutional backing to enforce the ideological vision that he had in mind. If we want to contrast Trumpism with, say, a National Review style conservatism. Before a true believing conservative was ever elected president, well, first you had, in the 1950s, the creation of National Review, other conservative magazines. You had grassroots organizations like Young Americans for Freedom. You have the failed campaign of Barry Goldwater. You have the so-called New Right of the 1970s. So then once Reagan was elected, there was an entire infrastructure there to fill the White House and to support him in Congress and to see a particular narrow ideological agenda put in place that was even able to be mostly successful with Democrats controlling the House. With Trumpism, like, who did he have? I guess he invited Bannon, and he had Stephen Miller and Jeff Sessions before he was made a pariah in the White House, kind of had a similar vision. But otherwise, it was, typical Republicans top to bottom. And then Trump outsourced all of domestic policy to Paul Ryan, who had his own specific, Tea Party agenda that he pursued. And then when Trump says, okay, it's time for the wall, well, the Republicans have already lost their majority in Congress. Right. And it was over. Nothing, so he got the White House, but he didn't have the means to really pursue anything that deviated too much from what his party's traditional platform had been.
Right. That accorded with my understanding. He just wasn't ready to govern, and so he ceded that ground to whomever appeared willing to carry that mantle. And in that case, that was Paul Ryan. That makes sense. And I, of course, didn't mean to suggest that the whole GOP has its extreme ethno-national goals.
Yeah, I was going to say that would be offensive to a lot of Republicans.
Yeah, but
to hear themselves called white nationalists. But then I got thinking about that. There, on some level, just the whole sort of anti-immigration sentiment, hints at that.
So that's not.
It really depends on your definition of white nationalism.
Right. That wasn't for me the biggest identifier, but just the fact that it is a party for white people. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be open to the milder arguments about white nationalism.
Yeah, no, this goes back to my earlier empirical work and some of my concerns about the future of American democracy. Because as I was arguing back in my dissertation and my first couple of books, we kind of are looking at two different models that both I consider suboptimal. We have, the California model for the future of partisan politics, or the Alabama model. So in the California model, we have a situation where minorities are overwhelmingly Democratic and whites are split about 50-50, which leads to, in a diverse state, overwhelming Democratic advantage forever. And then you have places in the Deep South where elections could essentially be done by the Census Bureau. Things are so racially polarized, where, even if it gets considerably more diverse, you still have competitive elections, but things are so divided along racial lines. I fear, partisan politics starts to be viewed as a zero-sum game of racial spoils, and that is obviously not anything we want to be looking at either. Yeah. And so the question is how do we reach a point where we have, two viable political parties that are both racially and ethnically diverse, and we've yet to stumble upon a model that works in that direction. And so whoever can figure that out may be the person who saves American democracy.
Well, there is one beacon of hope, and that is in Maryland and Massachusetts, where Charlie Baker and Larry Hogan have shown that moderate Republicans can exist and be elected in blue states and be widely popular with bipartisan support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I should have noted that governors can be exceptions to this. But for senators, I don't know that will ever really be possible. We'll see what happens with Doug Jones this fall. But national politics is so polarized that I fear that, at least in terms of who we're sending to the U.S. Senate, I don't know that that's too likely. But yes, those types of figures may be pointing a way to a viable future for the GOP.
So you have two papers in progress.
I assume probably a lot more.
And probably a lot more, but two that you've shown to us. One, we talked about the disappearance of at least the terminology of the alt-right. And the other is about conservative reactions to language around white privilege, which seems to say that there isn't really a backlash to that language. Am I interpreting it correctly?
Well, yeah, this is a paper I'm working on with Eric Kaufman and Richard Hanania. And what we are finding is that, we have to think about what we mean by backlash. And what the new sort of language of wokeness, maybe that's a terrible term for it, but everybody sort of intuitively knows what I mean by that.
Yeah, we know what you mean, yeah.
Does that hurt candidates who speak that way? And so we did a survey experiment just to find out. And what we found was that yes, voters are turned off by the language of sort of calling for explicit racial reparations, calling for explicit discussions of white privilege, as opposed to a more broad-based push for equity across the board that's not discussed in racial terms. We did find that in our hypothetical candidate, actually used the real candidate, Kirsten Gillibrand, we did see that led to a drop in support. But the interesting thing was that we didn't see a drop in support for the ideas themselves. In fact, we found the opposite. That is, people might be less likely to support a candidate who is pushing these ideas, but people who hear those types of thoughts were simultaneously more likely to support them. That is, hearing a major presidential candidate say that she supports reparations might not make you vote for that candidate, but it might also make you more willing to say that you support reparations. So we thought that was a very interesting thing, that even if there are short-term losses to progressives who speak in this kind of language, it does seem to be pushing the so-called Overton window farther to the left, which in the long run might be, more effective in achieving their long run vision than sort of the ephemeral goal of winning any one particular election. So,
quickly, what is the Overton window?
It's a term to describe the universe of what is considered possible in politics. And just as the alt-right wishes to push the window of what you can talk about, what you can consider on the table to include things like massive immigration cuts or even large deportations, on the progressive side, they would like to push the universe of what's possible to include things like, cash payments for reparations, that sort of thing, or a new large-scale amnesty for undocumented immigrants. So sorry, forgive me for not clarifying that from the beginning.
No, it's just my job to ask these basic questions.
Yeah.
So that certainly would be my read on the 2020 presidential campaign, where the candidates who were more woke, most notably Gillibrand, fizzled out early, but the Overton window has indeed moved left in terms of race and immigration.
Yeah, and we did this last fall, so we certainly couldn't have foreseen just how dramatically American politics would shift just over this summer. But it's under review. We'll see what happens with it. Hopefully, we'll be able to find a home for it at some point.
It's really interesting results.
And does this imply that generally sentiments are shifting in this country?
They have been shifting, actually, and this started probably back in 2012. We've been seeing sort of a steady movement to the left among whites on questions of race and immigration. However, this has not been uniform across parties. What we've been seeing is that white Democrats have become increasingly progressive over the past decade. Now, Republicans have not been, in contrast to what a lot of people think, Republicans have actually not been becoming more racist, more extreme, more nativist over this period of time. They've essentially stayed the same. But because the left is moving more left, we are nonetheless becoming more polarized, even though one side is really not moving very much at all. And if it's moving at all, it's been moving also to the left. For example, we've seen very strong shift among Republicans in their attitudes towards Muslims, according to surveys over the last decade, from at least what I was looking at in surveys research.
Nick, I'm sorry, you were going to ask something.
I would just qualify, I guess, to say that when you were speaking of this movement, you were talking just about attitudes towards race.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Great Awokening is fascinating to me, how it's just remarkable to me that many white progressives now have attitudes on race that are far to the left of non-whites.
Yeah, it's really been an impressive movement over this past couple of decades. And I think, I should the last single decade, obviously accelerating under the age of Trump. And I think part of this has to do with just the intensity of partisan fervor among Americans. And that is, our partisan identities are such a powerful part of our personal identities right now. And this is actually the subject of a book I'm working on right now, dealing with just the intensity to which we feel loyalty to our parties, even if we don't even understand the ideologies
right.
Beneath them. And so I think that after people wanted to be, they knew they were Democrats, and they knew that Trump was a nativist and perhaps a racist. Well, they were going to be the exact opposite of that, and the more opposite of that you were, the better partisan you were being.
But
I don't want to discount, the degree to which people are sincerely feeling these things. But I do, I think that, wanting to be a good partisan team player is something that is in the background on both sides for a lot of these discussions.
I certainly agree with that. I mean, I've seen all the data that shows that Americans don't necessarily share the policy preferences of their party. However, I was going to question the source, since the awokening seemed to happen in 2014, before Trump descended his gilded staircase.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you attribute the Great Awokening to? If I had to guess, it was a backlash to the backlash against Obama. I think you were hinting at something along those lines, Amy?
I think that's true. Yeah, certainly. As much as people would intentionally deny it, I think obviously a lot of the anxiety on the right that was, made explicit in the Tea Party, but the underlying sentiments never were. I think there definitely was a racial anxiety to Obama's presidency, and then of course it pushback to that from the left. I think, to be honest, I think social media has had some element to it where, it seems as though the more ideologically pure one is, tends to lead to greater levels of amplification. And, I think that's been an element as well. And some of it might just be, generational shift in attitudes, just becoming more progressive along a number of lines, racial being obviously the lead one. I don't think there's any single explanation here. Though I know that there are plenty of scholars at work trying to make sense of it, and I'm hopeful that someone will be able to explain it better to me in the near future.
Yeah, I think, some of these like super awokened ideas about language, for instance, and how we kind of need to rename everything and avoid certain words that could possibly have bad connotations. Like, on nextdoor.com, somebody piped in that you can't say lame anymore. I mean, it's just like all of that.
How do you bowl if you can't say lame?
So that feels like it's been just gradual over the past, 20 years. Something like that.
Why are they waging a war against bowling? But I digress.
I don't know. Is bowling perhaps implicitly white? I'm not sure. But
wait, what does bowling have to do with lame? I
thought you said lane, Lane.
Oh, lame.
Oh, okay. I've been thinking about bowling.
Ah, okay.
That makes more sense too, because I've been trying to figure out what the problem with lane could be, and now I realize there is no problem with it. Okay.
Right.
The fact that you deny a problem is only proof that there's a problem.
But yeah, lame as an ableist term, if I
exactly.
recall.
It's an ableist term. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have a take on the Harper's letter?
I read it, and I saw what it was responding to. I am still working through my thoughts on that. I have not yet come to a consistent or coherent position on it. I think I can understand the sentiments behind it. I think it was done a bit awkwardly, but I'm going to have to think on it a little bit longer.
You know what the Harper's letter is?
Yeah, I read it, and my thought was they shouldn't have included controversial figures among the signatories.
Who are the controversial figures?
Well, J.K. Rowling in particular.
Okay, but who counts as controversial?
I don't know.
Different people will have different.
Yeah.
I mean, my sense of it is I agree with it, but I think the amount of censorious energy coming from the left is often exaggerated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I should note I am trying to be. I'm fairly allergic to alarmism on any side. So just as I'm not going to, declare the existential threat that the alt-right poses, I'm certainly not going to jump on the bandwagon of stating that, wokeness is a threat to democracy either. Right. It's important to try to keep some degree of context in these sorts of questions. Yeah, I
agree with you there. I broadly supportive, but I certainly agree with the letter that two things. I agree with the letter that I'm much more concerned about right authoritarianism than left authoritarianism at this moment, and that left authoritarianism is constantly exaggerated, mostly on Twitter, and often is exaggerated for the purpose of clicks. Also, I think. Well,
I do actually really worry about a teacher's inability to talk honestly in a classroom, and to be able to bring up ideas from the past that were real ideas from the past and historical figures, and use language that properly expresses something without having to worry about offending somebody's sensibilities. So in that sense, I am concerned for our future a little bit in academia specifically.
Do you feel, George, great pressure to be cautious in your public utterances lest you get mobbed?
Not so much now that I'm not on Twitter anymore.
Right.
Not that I was ever particularly controversial, but I discovered that, just not being on social media just removed a fair amount of stress in my life. I was realizing I'm putting these thoughts out in the world, and I don't know who's going to, and I was in the unusual situation of having a lot of people on the far left and the far right as followers. And I found that life was just easier when I didn't have that in my life anymore. I will note that just in the classroom, I've been teaching some contentious subjects for a very long time. I teach a class on the conservative movement, for example. I've taught a class on immigration, and I haven't really changed anything over the past couple of years. I have them read things that would be considered very controversial today. If you want to know what National Review is writing about race and segregation in the 1950s, my students read that, and I think it's important to provide that particular context. Obviously, not providing any sort of endorsement, but I've not had any sort of pushback suggesting that this type of material doesn't belong in a classroom or anything. But who knows?
I totally agree with you. I don't feel much pressure in the classroom. The only pressure I felt is probably specifically in Utah, where there are some people who will, some students who will get very upset at profanity. I mean, not that I use it a lot in the classroom, but there was a lawsuit against my university about 20 years ago by a girl who was in the drama program, who didn't want to say fuck, and so she sued the school. Anyhow, so aside from that pressure, I don't feel pressure to watch myself too much in the classroom.
All right, I feel better. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. We should all feel better. Well, is there anything else, Amy, you want to ask George, or anything else, George, you want to say before I stop the recording?
No, I thank you for your time. I appreciate this opportunity.
This has been very interesting for us.
Yeah, I learned so much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, well, thank you.
All right, talk to you soon, I hope. Bye.
Yeah, anytime. Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Thanks for listening to The Professor and the Idiot. If you like what you heard, go to Apple Podcasts and give us a good rating. Your positive feedback completes us.